Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Said a Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is very, very special. I have a returning guest. I have with me Dr. Timothy Brookins. Our first episode, we discussed his book, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians, and it's Paul, Stoicism, Spiritual Hierarchy. Amazing, fantastic book. And he had mentioned that he was writing a book on Greek and Roman philosophy, easily titled Greek and Roman Philosophy, which is fantastic. This just came out. It's a survey of Greek and Roman philosophy for students of the New Testament, which is just everything that I love. I would love for more students of the New Testament to be reading philosophy and understanding the philosophers that are briefly mentioned in the New Testament, but also who are being interacted with by the early church fathers and on and on and on. So I'm really excited to be talking with him today. Before we jump in, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon, YouTube members, Spotify members. If you're listening to this somewhere, then there's also an opportunity to support your boy. So thank you for doing that. If this is your top 5, top 10 favorite podcast, please consider becoming a patron. I also have a bunch of sponsored links in the description wherever you're getting this at. So check those out. If you buy from those, you'll also be supporting me. That's huge. It's a win-win. And then I have these books linked in the description. So if you get them from those links, you'll also be supporting me. That's probably too much commodification. Let's jump in with Dr. Timothy Brookins and chop it up on ancient Roman and Greek philosophy. Dr. Brookins, thanks again for coming back on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah, man, I'm stoked for this. Like I said last time, I'm going to say it again. I love the way that you write because you are, I call you a New Testament scholar. That's right to say, right?
Yeah, that's primarily what I am.
Yeah. And you guys are like the footnote, like aficionados. You guys are like, I read this here and I'm showing you here. And when I was studying theology, I learned from you guys to do that. I started studying philosophy and all my philosophy professors were like, what are you doing with all these footnotes? Stop doing that. So I love that you're doing you're showing all the philosophical sources. Hey, if you want to read more, I will show you every single place you need to read. So I love that you use that style to talk about Greek and Roman philosophy.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I think you're right. There is something probably pretty exceptional about the field of biblical studies when it comes to footnotes. Simply because so much is written on the Bible.
Yeah.
More than any book. But I tried to lighten up the footnotes here, maybe because it's a philosophy book. More than biblical studies.
Which is, that's hilarious. This is your version of lightening it up. I caught that note in the beginning where you're like, look, man, if it's common knowledge that this is what Plato taught, then I'm not going to go through all of the footnotes in it.
Yeah.
Compared to a philosophy text, it's still like, it's epic. Before we jump in, I'm wondering, are those Loeb Classical Library books?
Yes, they're not the whole Loeb Classical Library. Maybe someday I'll have that one. Yeah, fair.
I was
Almost 100 of them now.
That is a major flex. So sometimes people will see these shiny ones back here, and it's like, that's cool. But you guys don't understand the Loeb Classical Library. Then that is the true flex. That's awesome. Well, Tim, can you just, for those who haven't seen our first one or aren't familiar with it, can you give us a little characterization of what you do for a living? What's your area of expertise?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I focus on the New Testament. My title is Professor of Early Christianity at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. So, trained in essentially early Christianity or Christian origins. And so been writing in that area, mostly with the focus on the New Testament since graduate studies. Really that my time at Baylor University in the PhD program got me started on this trajectory of the New Testament and philosophy that I've been working on in some way continuously since then.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so this is a survey of Greek and Roman philosophy, and I wonder if you have if that's a term of art, or like what should the reader be expecting from a survey?
Yeah. So by calling it a survey, I'm signaling that it's not for experts or specialists in Greek and Roman philosophy. So I'm not looking at all the intricacies of all of the Greek philosophical systems or of individual Greek philosophers. But who I have in mind primarily are students of the New Testament, as the subtitle indicates. And I'll give a shout out to my former colleague at Houston Christian University, Houston Maston, because in some ways I had him and people like him in mind as I wrote this. He's another expert in the New Testament who also happens to be strong in his understanding of Second Temple Judaism, so Judaism around the time of the New Testament writers, but was less expert in Greek philosophy. So those are the sorts of people I'm writing for, people who want to know the intellectual context in which the New Testament was written, in which the first missionaries went out to evangelize the world. Philosophy is a very important aspect of the culture, particularly the intellectual culture. And so while the New Testament itself doesn't seem to very directly and extensively engage philosophy, it is the world in which they lived and moved. And in some ways, philosophy was a serious competitor for converts, so to speak, with early Christian.
Yeah, I love that. And I had that in mind as well. The survey aspect, I think, it threw me a little bit because your book is actually really detailed. It's not so much so that it's not fun or anything like that, but you're coming up with all these charts and you're showing the history of philosophical schools, which you wouldn't know unless you took a master's level, history of philosophy. It's deeper than history of ideas. It's deeper than these kind of things. So I'm like, yes, it is a survey, but it is. I mean, you're doing due diligence as the NT scholar that you are. So I thought that was really helpful. I don't know how to explain it. You're going to get more out of it than you would a survey of the history of Western philosophy, but it's not so much that you're going to be overwhelmed. So
yeah, if I can just add to that, then the book has 17 chapters, and the average chapter is about 3,000 words. So if you can imagine writing a 10-page paper, that's about the average length of the chapter. So real bite sizes in that way. And so each chapter is going to take you through either a major philosopher like Plato or Aristotle, or each of the major schools of the time, for example, Stoicism or Epicureanism. And in that line, it's going to give you, say for the schools, what are the main departments of their philosophical system, and what is the summary sort of each part. Or for Plato or Aristotle, what are key concepts that we see running throughout their works and their philosophical system, to the extent that they had systems. But you noted each chapter also concludes with a short list of primary sources to read for that philosopher or philosophical school. It does have tables and figures that I actually think was a nice little touch, and I had some help formatting those from a former student named Mark Hines, which I very much appreciate. But some of those tables are kind of cool. For example, several of the figures show a genealogy of philosophers and philosophical schools from the beginning or from Socrates, kind of tracing a family tree. And there, some other tables also that give you kind of a summary of the view of each school, or my favorite, some information that had been distilled by another scholar that shows how many philosophers we have attested by count from each philosophical school in each century, to get a sense of which schools were most popular or perhaps most influential at that time.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I love the tables. I can't commend this book highly enough. And I think it's a way that you're still staying in your own lane while doing really good work that's going to help out philosophers. So I think that's fantastic. The stuff on Anaximander was really helpful because I never find stuff on him, but I named my dog after him. So my dog's name we call him Axie, but his name is Anaximander. And so I'm like, when I found that, I'm like, this is gold. There's primary text. I can't wait to dive in even deeper.
A lot of early philosophers that most people haven't heard of have X's in their names like that. Anaxagoras and Anaximander and
Anaximenes and
yeah.
you gotta love that. Well, okay, so here's another quick question before diving into some more of the details on the book. I get this all the time because I studied systematic theology, theological studies, and then philosophy and philosophy of religion. I still get Christians who are reading, maybe it's the KJV or something, saying, "Don't be, don't look out for vain philosophy and empty deceit.
Mhm.
Don't study philosophy; it's going to lead you astray. You're going to become a Gnostic." Blah blah blah. From your perspective is probably going to be a little bit different than mine. Why should a New Testament reader also be looking at the philosophy that's of the same time period?
Yeah, I guess there are several ways that we could attack this question. But let me just take it from this perspective. I mentioned earlier that the New Testament writers aren't really directly engaging philosophy or philosophers. I say that with some qualification. But particularly Paul's letters are written to churches throughout the Greek-speaking world in the Roman Empire that were predominantly Gentile, non-Jewish people. And to some extent, he has to accommodate the way that he speaks as a Jew to a Greek audience who were largely not educated in philosophy in a formal way, but would have been familiar with philosophical concepts. Some may have been lightly educated in Greek philosophy in some way. So we find Paul, for example, often deploying what we call philosophical commonplaces. So to give you one example, the idea of life as competition, and we're competing for a prize, but a prize that is imperishable rather than a perishable wreath, and where our adversaries are vices or sins, and we're pursuing a life of virtue or righteousness. We find that in 1 Corinthians 9, but we find something very similar in lots of places all over the philosophers. It was a very popular metaphor, common to philosophical discourse. And we see Paul doing that quite a bit. And so in that sense, this is Paul speaking the language of the times. Now, as we go on in Christian history, philosophy will be engaged much more directly and extensively by Christians.
Yeah. Yeah, that I love that point. There something that I forgot about this. This used to be a really big deal for me, but um, well, as a Christian philosopher, I have to just ham up Acts 17 as much as possible, always. And look, he mentioned these philosophers. He was speaking to the philosophers. But another thing that Paul does, which is hilarious, is he brings up the liar paradox in Titus, and he's like, the liar paradox is that it's by Epimenides, I believe, the Cretan, and he's like, hey, all Cretans are always liars, and that became a huge puzzle in logic today, even. And Paul's like, yeah, this sentence is true. This sentiment is true. Don't believe the Cretans, and it's just so funny because you look at it and you go, well, is Paul affirming a paradox, and therefore does that have problems for the inerrancy of Scripture? And you're like, no, he's using Jewish witticism. He's just making a joke. Like, yeah, he's familiar with this liar paradox, and he just runs into it and goes, yeah, don't listen to the Cretans. Anyways, Titus, let me go on with my letter. So I love finding those little gems. But I like what you're saying about the philosophical commonplaces. The themes are in there as well. And I want to jump ahead really quick and just ask, you think Jesus was a philosopher based on, not only a philosopher, but could he be considered a philosopher based on this old school philosophy as a way of life, kind of building schools and followers understanding?
Well, so if I can approach this the way that Diogenes Laertius does in his Lives of Eminent Philosophers, he gives us biographies of different Greek philosophers, but he begins the work by tracing the origins of philosophy. And he points out that there was philosophy outside of the Greeks. And there's philosophy a long time before Socrates and Pythagoras, that the Babylonians were doing philosophy. The Babylonian philosophers were the Chaldeans, right? The Persian philosophers were the Magi. The Egyptians had their own philosophers. All of these civilizations had people who were doing philosophy thousands and thousands of years before Greek philosophers like Socrates were doing philosophy. So in a way, you asked, is Jesus a philosopher in the way a Greek philosopher was a philosopher? Basically, a definition established by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. No, isn't. Is he doing something analogous to what the philosophers are doing? I'd say yes. And this is what Christians, particularly in the 3rd and 4th century, began to do. Is they began to set philosophy and Christian theology side by side and say, look, if we sort of formulate these things in a parallel way, in what way is Christianity like, but essentially subversive of or a rival of with the Greek philosophy? And they said, if we read the New Testament writers like Paul, we can extract from those writings kind of a systematic presentation of Christianity that mirrors kind of a systematic presentation of a Greek philosophy. So what each of the philosophical schools did among the Greeks was to say, look, there has to be some highest goal of human life, what they called the telos, sometimes translated as the end. And each philosophical school had a different idea of what that end was. But the teachings of the philosophy would be to say, here's how to get to that end. And when you get to the end, there is happiness. And that's something that we can attain in our lives. And so church fathers like Origen, Clement of Alexandria, but particularly Augustine, because he elaborates this in a lot of detail. Augustine, in his monumental work, The City of God, in Book 19, he actually explicitly puts Christian theology within the context of this conversation among philosophers. And he says, look, here are all of the different views philosophers have about the telos, about the highest good of humanity. And he says, here are the best of those options. And he says, but here's the Christian telos, which he says is eternal life in the heavenly city with God. Essentially means participating in God, right? Being in repentance eternally. So that is in stark contrast with what all of the philosophers had said. Because for all of the philosophers, the promise was, here's how to attain happiness now in this life if you live by these principles. It wasn't an eschatological kind of happiness, where Augustine insists, well, you can experience some of this peace in Christ in this life, but ultimately we await arrival in the heavenly city before all of that comes to its climax.
Oh, amen, man. That's a great point. I love that. I haven't done a word study on this, and I would like to, but some of the ancient Greeks emphasizing eudaimonia type of happiness, the end, the fulfillment. And dude, this is totally on the spot, and I haven't warned you about this or anything, but Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, he starts it with the Beatitudes, the Makarios, and just doing a quick study, it's like that's happiness, but it's not like the fleeting happiness. It's in my head, it's similar to like the eudaimonia type view, but I actually don't know the relationship between those. But Christ is saying, hey, if you want to be blessed, if you want to have happiness and richness, here's what you do. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are, and it's like this topsy-turvy view on what all the other philosophers would have said. But he's doing it on a mountain in front of all of his followers, saying, this is the blessed life. Here's what the good life is, and it's basically like, come follow me.
Yeah, I know. That's really good. And I think that would be an example of us looking back and saying, if we wanted to formulate Jesus' teaching in a way that sort of echoes the way that the philosophers saying, Jesus is saying what the blessed life consists in, or who counts as blessed. It's sort of like what the philosophers do, like here's what happy life consists.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for that. I'd love to. Every history of philosophy has to start somewhere, and one of the major critiques that I always get from people is like, "Hey, you're not looking at Indian philosophy." And it's like, "Yeah, no, I'm not. I'll narrow it down to Western philosophy." But what counts as Western? Blah blah blah. I totally get it. Everyone has to start somewhere. Gordon Clark starts his history of philosophy with Thales, and he says philosophy started, and he gives like the exact moment, and you're like, that's kind of funny. And he's like, yeah, but this is when Thales predicted an eclipse, a lunar eclipse, and so that was like the first. It's not really philosophy, but whatever. You talk about philosophy going back, like all the way back, super far back, but you're like, well, there's these two figures, at least Anaximander and Pythagoras, who maybe coined the term independently, and we can kind of use them as a reference point. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit?
Yeah. So Diogenes Laertius, I referred to earlier, wrote the lives of eminent philosophers. Might feel like an infinite number of
Well, yeah,
philosophers.
infinitely, yeah, and
Yeah.
Anaximander there. Yep.
Yeah. And one thing that chroniclers of that time wanted to do, to be able to trace successions of a tradition all the way back. And those are always oversimplifying, I think. But Diogenes basically adopts the scheme that says, well, there were two independent lines from which Greek philosophy originated. So one was the Ionian line in what would be modern day Turkey, Western Turkey. And that's Thales, who asked, we have, a plurality of things in this universe, but is there something that unites them all together? Is there some fundamental underlying principle that unifies things? And Thales says, yes, it's water. All things are water. Which might sound, counterintuitive, but we also don't have Thales' writings, and maybe he very intelligently defended that.
Sure.
But the other line was the Italian line that traced back to Pythagoras, who, as far as we know, actually was the first man to call himself a philosophos, using the Greek word, which we translated as philosopher. And so the origins of that word are actually pretty varied. It meant different things to different people. And we think it was actually originally meant as a slur. A philosopher was someone who wanted to be wise.
Yeah,
wise,
I
right?
cut that. I
They
love that.
pretended to be wise, trying to be wise. And Pythagoras said, well, okay, yeah, I am. I do want to be wise. I am trying to be wise, and I'm trying to seek out to do that. And so that, so he was the first. And that language kind of stabilized, gained a stable definition with Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, and that just rings so true to me that that it started as a pejorative and then he just owned it, because that happens all the time. All these schools of thought, you look at them, you're like, yeah, that was a pejorative. Oh, Calvinism. Oh, Arminianism. Oh, presupposition. Like all of them start as pejoratives, and then someone just goes, "Fine, I'll eat it. I don't care."
Yeah, and that describes the thing. Yeah,
yeah. Except like then you get to the sophists, and it's like, well, that one's still bad. Like the sophist still doesn't mean something good. It's from Sophia, wisdom.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to do another anachronism. What about King Solomon? Like in my book, this is, he is the philosopher king. He is like the philosopher king that Plato talks about, except that he is having his own wives, and that actually leads to his downfall. So maybe he could have learned something from that if Plato had lived when he had. But do you think of King Solomon as a philosopher?
Yeah, again, we just have to distinguish Greek philosopher from the broader definition of philosopher. And, we could probably debate all day what was the most fitting definition. But I think, and this goes back to discussion, the time of Herodotus, around the time of the pre-Socratic philosophers, that a philosopher is someone who is reflectively trying to understand the nature of things and how it all fits together in a way that provides a really comprehensive or holistic account of the way things are and what that means for how we ought to live within it. For Solomon, as a king of Israel from the ancient Near East, we do have surviving in tablets and things, wisdom works from other ancient Near Eastern culture, the Babylonians, from the Egyptians. And actually, when you compare them, often they have very similar sounding wisdom. So take the biblical book of Proverbs, for example, and a lot of that mirrors what you find in other ancient wisdom tradition. And so the ancient Near East, because it was all geographically connected, there was in some ways a shared tradition. For the Jews, though, that would be integrated into their traditional Yahwism, right? Their worship of Yahweh and the law that they had received. And so again, you read the Proverbs, you read Ecclesiastes, which traditionally is attributed to Solomon, and it is asking questions about, what does it all mean?
Mhm.
What's the purpose of life? Why am I here? Is there a purpose of life? And if so, what is it? So yeah, I think those books are asking philosophical questions in the really general sense of it.
Yeah.
That I think if you had asked Plato, say, was Solomon a philosopher? Plato might have said, well, yes, in the sense that he wants to know not just how to live, but how to live well. That's a saying attributed to Socrates. Not just how to live, but how to live well, how to live the best kind of human life there is. And first, we have to ask, what kind of life is that before we can actually do it?
Yeah. That's great. And that definition from Herodotus is gold, man. That's really great. I need to look that up. This book has been so helpful for me. I'm writing a book right now. It's a philosophy book, and it's on like practical philosophy, how to actually not practical philosophy as in ethics, but as in like how to actually do philosophy yourself with a notebook. And this is actually super timely and helpful because trying to regain the philosophy as a way of life type motif without being trite and cliche is not super easy to do. But all the sources that you help, it's so good, man. It's so helpful. So I appreciate that. While you were studying for this, while you were doing the preparatory work and all that, did you find yourself having a favorite philosopher, school of philosophy? Did you come out leave like with someone you're like that guy's the man, or that school, even though they're not Christians, has something to it or is fun to look at?
Yeah, well, from the beginning, as I mentioned, this goes back to grad school. When I was working on my dissertation, starting back in 2009, I wrote on First Corinthians in the background, or sorry, Stoicism in the background of First Corinthians, and I always sort of gravitated towards Stoicism. Um, Stoicism is monotheistic in a sense. There's one divine reality that God is intelligent, that he exercises providential care over the universe, that creation is orderly and rational, that we as human beings, there's a natural law built into the universe that we're to live by, that virtue is the highest good of all. So lots to admire about Stoicism if you're a Christian. But that's ignoring all of the very fundamental differences
Yeah.
also, of course. And the word stoic in the English language can have a negative connotation, right? Basically, as a synonym for someone who is cold and unfeeling. When you often feel compassion or something like that. But I actually find myself drawn to, in a different way, to the Skeptical Academy. So the academy was founded by Plato, but early on, his followers kept it dogmatic, meaning they had doctrines that allegedly Plato had taught, that they tried to safeguard and systematize and preserve in a way that Plato said, this is what we believe. It was a dogmatic school. Later on, the academy took a skeptical turn, really in response to Stoicism and Epicureanism, which were both very dogmatic or positivistic. They said, we can actually trust our senses and reason to give us knowledge that is secure and undoubtable. And the Skeptical Academy said, well, hold on, can we really be sure that we ever know something positively? He said, well, maybe not. And so really what the skeptics' point was to say, each of you guys that follows the teachings of a particular teacher can't be confident that the guy that founded this system has everything right. You can't be sure about that. And so we should always be free to look at all of the evidence. And if it looks like Epicurus was wrong on a particular point, we don't have to take Epicurus whole. That the evidence, it probably leads in this direction rather than in this direction. So as skeptics, that didn't mean necessarily we can't know anything, and therefore we always, leave things in the balance. That there was a certain stage in the history of skepticism where they said, we don't believe in in dogmas, but we believe in probability. We've weighed all the evidence. This one appears the most probable or most like the truth or most likely to be the truth. And therefore we affirm that as the probable truth. And in some ways, that's what any scholar or philosopher is doing, right? There is a freedom to say, I don't have to take one particular thinker and say he was right on all particular points. And I can never doubt that. Because it could be right in major outline, but they could be wrong in this other particular point. We weigh the evidence and we make judgments about what we think is most probable. Cicero, Roman philosopher, was actually an adherent of that particular line of thinking, probabilism. So I find myself drawn to that one.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I always saw those guys as the enemy when I was like in my theological studies, because I'm like, dude, you guys are the ancestors of Plato and stuff, and you're like, come on, what are you doing? And then reading up on them a little bit more and seeing that they, at least from the sources I read, they were identifying themselves with Socrates, saying, look, like this is what Socrates did. He's going around poking holes in everyone who said they had knowledge. And the only thing he said he knew was that he didn't know. And so we're just doing what the forefather did. Except when it comes in, I don't know how true this is or whatever, but in Augustine's City of God, they're putting this challenge to him, and they're like, what if you're wrong about everything you believe? And Augustine says, well, see foul or sum. If I'm mistaken, at least I exist. So I can't be wrong about my existence. And Descartes just goes, yeah, I'll take that. And assume no footnote, which is really fun. But that's really fascinating that you bring that up. That shifts my my liking to them even more. So I'll have to jump in on that some more. So that brings me to Socrates, though. Some Christians, even throughout church history, they want to kind of baptize Socrates or say that he was a preparatory figure to the Greeks. He was this figure who's going around challenging everyone's beliefs, challenging polytheism, pointing to the one goodness or good, the transcendental, maybe whatever it is. And then he's killed by the people, and he takes the cup himself. No one took his life from him. He drank it himself. You can see some allusions, whatever. What do you make of? I'm sure I would say you probably don't think that, but what do you make of the figure of Socrates? And in light of, God's providence, was he preparing the way for the Greeks, or is that just like an accident of history, you think?
Yeah, I don't really. I do think that there's a God that exercises providential care over the movement of history and everything like that.
Yeah.
So maybe in that sense, no, it wasn't an accident. But Socrates was incredibly important for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
One was he did introduce a critical shift in the focus of philosophy. They famously said Socrates brought philosophy from heaven down to earth. So whereas the earlier philosophers were looking at the heavens to understand the nature of things, or what they would just call physics, Socrates says, no, let's think about life here. What is the best way to live? As we said, not just living, but living well. Socrates also had a number of students that founded successful philosophical schools, and the lineage of most of the major schools traces back to him too. So he was incredibly important. And you could argue that success was due to the fact that he was on to some truth. And that is that, there are a variety of things that we can call good, but are the things that we're calling good actually good? And are they the highest goods? And so Socrates was on a quest to understand, what the highest goods were, how to define those things. He was kind of like the modern YouTuber. And you walk around on the streets, interviewing, what is justice? What do you think justice is? But constantly problematizing it for people and saying, yeah, but what about this? Can that really be justice if this other thing is true? And then leaving the person ultimately stuck, which is probably underlies in a really major way why Socrates was brought to trial and executed, is because he was annoying, but they annoyed the wrong people. Because the people he targeted were the rich and powerful and educated, those reputed to be wise. I mean, Plato actually says those are the people he went seeking wisdom from. And when you anger and irritate and ultimately shame the proud, that usually doesn't go well for you, right? And you imagine Jesus' confrontation with the religious leaders. There's a certain shaming that actually boiled over into then hatred of him, right? And so, yeah, the other thing about Socrates, maybe as a preparatory figure, is that he was said to have not believed in the traditional gods, but introduced new gods. And he says, yeah, in a way that's true. He talks about these divinities that actually he calls daimonia, which we think of as demons, but really just meant spirits. But he also talks about this deity called the god, ha theos in Greek, calls it not God, but the god. Seems to be one supreme deity, but that this God spoke to him on occasion. And this God directed his life, told him how to act, or more correctly, told him often how not to act. He said whenever he was going to do something wrong, the God would pull him back and tell him not to do it, right? And so was Socrates, authentically connecting with God in receiving in a way even special revelation? I had no way how to evaluate his religious experience, but clearly he was open to change where he thought it was in the direction of truth and what is.
That's really cool. Yeah. So often people use the Greek word daemon or whatever, and then a fundamentalist Christian would go, that just means demon. And you're like, what? So he was talking with demons, but I don't think I actually even knew that he was using the phrase ha theos. That's pretty huge. That's monumental, man. That's great. I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this is in Plato's account of Socrates' defense speech. Yeah. At his trial.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm so.
Well, that's awesome. One thing that I've recently discovered in my philosophy master's was that Socrates was the progenitor of other schools. And Plato's like, no, here's the lineage. And then Aristotle gets mad and starts his own. But things like Diogenes the Cynic, like the Cynicism, they want to trace their roots back to Socrates as well. And then Stoicism traces its roots up through Cynicism to Socrates, I believe, unless I'm getting that wrong. Can you help us with cynicism? Because like you said, Stoicism today means like stolid or like maybe stolid, unemotional. Some people think that's good. Most people are like, no, dude, you need to cry at your mom's funeral. Don't be stoic. But the Cynics is like, oh, you're a jerk. You're mean. You're cynical. Can you give us a characterization? What does ancient cynicism look like?
Yeah, that's a good point, because both of those terms in English don't exactly capture what philosophical school was like originally. But you mentioned the lineage, and I think this is helpful just for giving a picture chronologically of these schools. Socrates died in 399 BC. And 10 of his students were collectively called the Socratics, and 5 of them established philosophical schools that were pretty successful. In the case of Cynicism, though, it's not really appropriately considered a school. So basically, Socrates has a student named Antisthenes. And whether it was Antisthenes or his own student, Diogenes of Sinope, it was the true founder of Cynicism. In any case, Cynicism essentially was a way of life apart from any kind of theoretical philosophical system. The basic principle was that human beings have, by convention, built up all of these rules and customs for ourselves that aren't really embedded in nature. So life really is simple. Live as nature dictates, which means little is required. Nature provides what we need to eat. It provides enough for us to clothe ourselves. It provides certain kinds of shelter. But what they were doing, and that all other philosophers are trying to do, is to say, how can I guarantee my happiness? And so basically the Cynic answer was, okay, if I feel like I have to have luxurious clothing and extravagant food to be happy, then maybe I won't consider those things good anymore. And if I lower the bar for the things that I think I need, then I can always be happy, because the bar to attain it is actually lower, right? And so they thought, well, how do you prepare yourself to live happily in any circumstances? And they said, by subjecting yourself to hardship. And it's what we think of as asceticism, actually very much associated with cynicism. The Greek word ascesis means practice, practicing for hardship, because you can't control all of the things that the universe gives you. You know, what they would have called fortune, 2K. Fortune's going to give you things. Sometimes it seem good and sometimes they seem bad. But if you voluntarily give yourself those things to learn how to tolerate them, now you can say, I can be happy in all circumstances, right? So it's a very minimalistic philosophy. They emphasize, hardiness, minimalism, and indifference towards any kind of external good. Like food, clothing, shelter, fame, fortune. And so the Stoics did, in a way, derive from the Cynics. And they shared with the Cynics the idea that, kind of in a hierarchy of goods, external and bodily goods don't rank highly. And the Cynic would say those things aren't goods at all. The Stoic modified that and said, well, having money isn't necessarily good. It is indifferent, but I would prefer to have it than not to have it, right? My bodily wholeness is good. I would rather have all 4 of my limbs than not. I would prefer that, but if I didn't, I can still be indifferent to it. I can still be totally happy. So they modified the idea of indifference and introduced this idea of preferred and unpreferred.
That's right. Yeah.
Which a lot of people had a problem with. The other thing, though, is they built up a very intricate theoretical system that the Cynics didn't. Right? The Cynics was all very simple. But Zeno, the first Stoic, dates around 300 BC, founds this system that continues to be elaborated by his students until the third successor, the second successor, named Chrysippus, is said to have written 600 books, which is always a mistake, it turns out, in antiquity, because what happens is if you write too much, nobody can read it. If they want to access your thought, they always have to look at the handbooks, the epitomes. And and then people don't quite understand you the way that you wanted to be and so on. But so there's a common lineage between the Stoics, the Cynics, tracing back to Socrates.
Do you know, were the Cynics still around and practicing by the time, maybe after Zeno, his first and second generations of followers, were they still contemporaries, or was Cynicism kind of dying out and leading into Stoicism?
Yeah. The tough thing with Cynicism is that because they didn't have a philosophical system, most of them didn't write. Because many of them advocated for homelessness and wandering. Many of them didn't have the resources to do that. So the evidence is a little bit scanty for Cynicism. And so it's often been said that the Cynic movement or way of life sort of dwindled, between 300 BC and the first century. But that might not have been true. It might just be a matter of surviving sources. Cynicism did seem to have a resurgence around the first century, around Jesus and the New Testament writers. And it does continue for centuries after that. And actually, if we look at the chart counting philosophers of different schools.
What page you got here?
Yeah, let's see. This is going to be one of the tables of tested philosophers by schools and centuries. So either page 120 or 147.
Okay.
So what you'd have is well, not to leave a gap here, but looking at table 9, in the first century, you have more Stoics than anything else, then Platonists, then Epicureans, then Cynics, then Pythagoreans, Aristotelians, academicians, and Puritists. So Cynics having some fairly good representation there in the first century, but we find Cynics going up through the even the 5th century. And since Cynicism didn't come with a theoretical system, it could be combined with other philosophies, and it could be combined with a Christian way of life.
Yeah, that was
Yes.
my next question. Yeah.
Yeah, the asceticism of it could really, you can do Christianity cynically,
Hmm.
so to speak. And there's a really good book by Marie um, Calais, I think is how you say it, um, called Cynicism and Christian Origins.
Yeah.
It takes us through some of that. Some from the the patristic period, Christians who were in a way cynics and could be called cynics, but they did it in a Christian way, Christian beliefs.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm wondering. I think it'd be hard to follow Diogenes in a Christian way because that dude was nuts.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. Yeah. So it depends, I guess, on how you define, cynicism. Do you
yeah,
have to take Diogenes' personality with it?
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe.
that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Allowing for personality differences, especially if there's not a codified system, which just seems hard. Yeah, it seems hard. Like, how do you get to call yourself a cynic if we don't have any formal doctrines? Well, generally, it's a family resemblance, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
Um,
good way to say it.
yeah. I love the description. I don't know who said it, but it like Diogenes is like a Socrates gone mad, and this
Right.
dude is out there challenging social norms and stuff. But and some of it's cool and hilarious, and others you're like, dude, are you serious? Like, can you not do that in the public square, please?
Yeah, yeah. It's just squatting down and defecating while in the middle of a speech at the risk.
Yeah, it's wild. Another philosophical school that people who've read the New Testament will be familiar with is Epicureanism. And I think that's probably another one that gets a bad rap or maybe not a bad rap, but just confused where it's like, well, these guys are hedonists and they just love pleasure. And you think of, just orgies and wine and stuff like that. But you'll hear about it in Acts. Paul is talking with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and you go, okay, there you go. Well, there's the pleasure guys and the non-pleasure guys. Can you give us a characterization? Who are the Epicureans and what did they believe?
Yeah, no, it's a really good preface to them. Yeah, we think of them as pleasure seekers, um, meaning they're seeking to maximize pleasure in kind of way that titillates the senses as much as they can be titillated, right? And that's not actually the kind of pleasure they were after, because that's not what they meant by pleasure. Epicurus, the founder of the system, that dates around 300 BC, like Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. Epicurus said, well, really, the fundamental problem with human beings is that they fear the gods. They live in constant fear of punishment because the gods are fickle and mercurial, and people live in constant mental anguish. And so Epicurus says, first, we don't need to worry about that because the gods actually don't really care that much. Actually, the gods are aloof, off doing their own thing between worlds, and they're not even watching what's happening. And they didn't even create this world. This world was created by atoms falling through space, and because they're all in different sizes, when they collide, eventually you create universes out of it. And the gods are just doing something else. So don't worry about that. Don't worry about mental anguish. So what Epicurus thought his system solved was this problem. He said, if we can just live free of pain, both mental and bodily, then we'll be happy. So that's actually what he meant by pleasure. The goal of life was to not feel pain, to reach what they said, ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. And the way to do that was not to maximize pleasure in the sense of titillating the senses, because your bender the night before, get the hangover the next day, and that's painful, and that's not pleasure. So everything was about having just enough to eliminate pain, eating just enough, eating a moderate amount, right? Maybe limiting the number of sexual partners that you have. Also limiting your involvement in spheres of society that could cause you anxiety. So he said, let's not get involved in politics because there are a lot of stress involved and can endanger your life. The kind of politician we don't like. The best kind of life is lived in a small community with close friends who are helping each other live by these principles of how to avoid pain by getting control of ourselves, by remembering the basic principles of the philosophy that atoms created everything, that the gods aren't going to punish you. And so, yeah, a very different way of looking at hedonism, right, than we tend to think.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. The more I learn about them, the more them and the Stoics, the more it's like, man, I really would have loved to hear Paul talk with these guys. Like, what is he, how is he trying to convince them of Christianity, and how good was he? Because at the Areopagus, some people want to say, look, that was a total failure, and see how he's not quoting scripture. He's just talking about the concepts, and then he changes tune. And you're like, no, that's not. I don't think that's true at all. I think he knew his audience well, but some of them thought he's talking about multiple gods. He's a seed picker, but then others believed, and so you're like, I don't know how good he was. Probably decent. You know, he's got the Holy Spirit in him guiding him. He's a smart guy. It'd just be so fun to see, like, what kind of points are you making against these kind of guys?
Yeah, because we get the speech in Acts, but it's got to be an epitome of the speech, right? The
Right.
speech had to have been longer than 60 seconds or
Sure.
whatever. Yeah.
And yeah, and that was after he got invited from, talking in the square with these guys, so I don't know, maybe he's there for a week or something. Who I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be very long, but again, Luke is condensing
That's
about
right.
30 years of Christian history worldwide into it's cute.
That's a good point. Yeah, this has been awesome, man. I'm gonna ask you for some like cultural exegesis, which maybe that's out of your wheelhouse, but maybe not. All of these, this is like the cultural context that's going on leading up to the New Testament, during, and then after. We see Justin Martyr and other folks to various degrees either embracing or challenging the philosophy of the day. When you think about that today, philosophers aren't really telling you how to live the good life. I know this from personal experience, and that's okay. They just don't see themselves that way anymore. And they some of them kind of sneer at it, especially analytic philosophers, and sneering, I'm not guru or something like that. Who do you think, who are the people telling us how to live a good life today? And if the Lord tarries for another 2,000 years, who are the people who are going to be in the American and UK, philosophy book like this?
Well, I mean, if you're asking about philosophers today that are pointing us that way, I have no idea. Look at what you saying. It's out of my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Of course, I identify with the Christian tradition, and so I would say we find it there. But if I can mention or recommend a book by New Testament scholar Joshua Jipp called Calling Theology as a Way of Life. It's kind of strangely a new way of doing Pauline theology. When we talk about Pauline theology, we tend to focus on areas of his thought, teriology, his view of justification, his eschatology. We call it a loci approach. And Jipp says, no, let's not approach it that way. Let's approach his theology as a way of living that is the best way of living that promises us the best end. And so Jipp sets Paul side by side with the Greek philosophers and saying, look, Paul is doing a similar sort of thing. But what Jipp does is he puts a third dialogue partner in, and it's the positive psychologist. I don't know how familiar you are with this particular movement in psychology, but the idea is psychology tends to focus on pathology and things that are wrong with us and how to, inhibit or diminish the effects of those things on us. Positive psychology says, well, no, actually, let's ask, how can a human being flourish? What does the best kind of life look like? What are the ingredients that go into that? And they're trying to base this on empirical evidence. And in general, they're divorcing it from any particular religion, although they do allow that religion can play a role insofar as it produces virtue, encourages community. But in general, it's an religious, empirically based way of talking about best way to live. What makes life? What are the main ingredients? So you got those guys.
Yeah, that's great. When I was at TEDS, I just never ended up taking a class with Josh Jipp, but I should have. And I'll definitely grab that and try to get him on. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great book to talk about.
Yeah. I think from I work in college ministry, and a lot of the younger millennials, if you ask them 5 years ago, it's Jordan Peterson. Now he's kind of gone off the deep end a little bit, I think, into politics. But oh yeah, I'm still looking. Unfortunately, some of the people that they're looking at are really terrible examples of what it means to be a good life, because their vision of the good life is all jacked up, anyways. I think, but yeah,
probably true.
yeah. Unfortunately, it's a huge bummer.
Yeah, the loudest voices aren't necessarily the ones that are most conducive to your health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with my reference to your book, it's like, man, if the Lord tarries for 2,000 years, we're gonna have like, Jordan Peterson and like the influencers philosophy for New Testament scholars. I don't know. Hopefully not. We'll see. Maybe he won't tarry that long.
No comment.
Yeah. But Tim, thanks so much for this book, man. Thanks for this other book too, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians, Paul, Stoicism, and Spiritual Hierarchy. I commend these books. You guys can find these links in the description. If somebody wanted to come study with you, let's say someone's here, they got their master's in theology or New Testament or something, how can they study with you? And then if they're not going to do the academic route, but they want to learn more from you, where can you point them?
Yeah. I'm not directing, graduate theses or anything like that at St. Thomas. I do have my books and articles. You mentioned, two of the books. I have, mid-level commentaries on First Corinthians, and on First and Second Thessalonians, that I think are great for, educated readers who aren't necessarily experts in New Testament studies. I have been doing lately more podcast episodes. I don't have a podcast of my own, but appreciate it again for you having me on. But I've been on several of those recently, talking about the two recent books that we talked about.
That's awesome. So let's say someone wants to come study at St. Thomas. They could. I mean, you're teaching classes they could take, and they could talk about Stoicism in your office hours and stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. But you could always audit the class. I teach primarily New Testament classes. Audit a class on the main campus. I mentioned I also teach jointly with their seminary, St. Mary's Seminary, training Catholic priests. But those classes also are open for credit to anybody. So
awesome. That's huge. Yeah, I only ask because someone's going to ask me, and they're going to be like, "How do I do that?" And I don't know, man. So here you go. There it is for you. Well, awesome. This has been fantastic. I can't wait till the next one, because I want to keep having you on. This has been really great, and we scratched the surface on this book. So just go and buy the book and read it, and learn Greek and Roman philosophy, and read the recommended readings, and you'll be an expert. It's unreal. Awesome. All right. Well, that's going to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.